check. Do you need me to check it over here? Okay. Can you come down? Absolutely. Every time. Outs on the back counter if you didn't get them. Yeah, there's two different ones. Yeah, there's two different ones. Okay. Yeah. Well, I was talking today. I'll probably. Did you have a question, Tim? Oh yeah. So if you have a question at any point before, during, or after that you want answered, since we'll be together for 3 weeks, you can write it on a note card. So like if there's like a topic you really want us to cover, or like a question at the end of tonight that we don't get to, put it on there and then we'll cover it at some point. Part of actually the idea for this partially came from Pastor Catherine. She actually did a Sunday school on this same topic in the fall, like around October, and I went with them. Was with them during their like second session that they had, and so that kind of was the start of the idea. Yeah, so here we are. 3. Yep. And I guess we're pretty much at. I guess we have 1 minute. We'll just stare at each other in silence for a minute then. Were you? Oh, yeah. Yeah. And Tim, you too. Yeah. Bummer. Yeah. Yeah. Just 1 extra week. All right. Well, we'll go ahead and get started. Thanks, y'all, for coming. Like I just said, a lot of this idea is from Pastor Catherine about the topic. And I'm excited to share it with you all because I come from the speech language pathology world. And so I feel like this is like worlds colliding for me. And so I'm excited to share this with you. And then, Vanessa, are you able to put the slide? Oh, okay. No worries. So let me introduce the two handouts because we're kind of going to bounce between the two of them. This one that has like the graphics on it, this is a resource that I got for free from PlaySpark, which is like an advocacy group. This has got this is like a really helpful basic, like I wasn't even going to try and recreate it because it's just got a lot of basic definitions that we're going to go through tonight. My hope for tonight is kind of to get us kind of oriented to like what this topic is, what the vocabulary is, so that we're set up so as we go through these weeks and talk about more specifics. So this is one resource that we'll use, and the other one is just a handout, which is some stuff collected. We can go ahead and go to the next slide. This is just that verse from Matthew 5 that I was thinking about as preparing it, about how we are the light of the world and to let our light shine. And I think that goes for all of us. And we're going to talk about people who are neurodivergent, but what does it mean to have all of our light shine a little bit differently? And they all we do all of it to bring glory to God in heaven. Just something to get us started, and then we can go to the next one. So, like I said, I'm a licensed speech language pathologist, which means that I know just enough to be dangerous. But I am not a psychologist. I have only studied these things in little bits. I'm not qualified. I will not pretend to be to diagnose. I've had a lot of experience with working with people who are neurodivergent. I myself am neurodivergent. My spouse is neurodivergent. It's genetic, so there are members of my family who are probably neurodivergent. And so I have personal and professional connections, and I have like professional experience. But again, I can't diagnose. I'm just giving you just some like basic information to help us to get some better understanding and context to things. So I've said that. So then thinking about kind of our theological and scripture foundations going into this, I'm going to use this because those are kind of small. If you were with us during the healing Bible study that we did on Wednesdays, we talked a lot about the ways in which Jesus spent time caring for and healing people who were cast out and misunderstood. And so I think that that image of Jesus is really helpful as we start to study this and how people are so different. Also, the Bible tells us that we are children of God, and there aren't exemptions on that. There aren't qualifications for that, and we are unconditionally loved. So in the same way that God loves us, and God created us, and so God knows all these intricate things about us. And so I just invite us to go into this with grace for me. As like I said, I have a surface level knowledge, and I'm excited to share it with y'all, but I'm by no means an expert. But also just, I hope studying this for me has allowed me to have greater grace and empathy for other people, so I understand how our brains work differently. So I just invite you to that with me. And then we also, I don't know if we'll get to it tonight. I have no idea how far we'll get tonight, but I also want to spend some time looking at what disability looks like in the New Testament. And disability is a much bigger umbrella, and we'll get there, than neurodivergence. But I think it's a helpful idea to know that what disability looked like in the Bible, because it's dramatically different than how we understand those things today. So at the top of that, the handout with the box on top, without the pictures, I have a couple of questions that these are like really broad questions, but these are the things that I'm thinking about as we have these conversations. So how does understanding, and what I mean by understanding is like knowing about neurodiversity, how does this understanding move us towards loving God and loving our neighbors as ourselves? And how do we move closer to grace, towards a unified body, towards deeper grasp of Imago Dei, which is being created in the image of God, and to be able to live more faithfully together in community. So those are the things that I invite us to think about, and hopefully those are questions that we'll start to answer. But I think those are lifelong questions. And then finally, just to acknowledge that in this room, we're a mixed bag of probably neurotypical and neurodiverse folks. And so just recognize that we are probably going to be thinking about things differently. And I don't know if we'll get there tonight, but like if we start talking about a certain neurodivergence and you're like, wow, that really resonates with me, I think that's really helpful to pay attention to. But know that like doesn't mean that you are that thing. It doesn't mean that you are not that thing. There's a lot of overlap, and which is really cool. And also just know that a lot of these are arbitrary boxes that, without getting on a tangent, that are really, they're made for insurance purposes when we start talking about like specific symptom groups. So just know that like people are way more complex than that. Your brain is way more complex to that. This is simply just like language to help us start to wrap our heads around those things. So, okay, lots of caveats. We can go to the next slide. I've kind of already said this. This is kind of where we're going to go, and we'll just get as far as we can get. We've got 3 weeks together. But we're going to start with some orientation and some vocabulary. We're going to talk about what the Bible says about it. We're going to talk about some specific examples of what neurodivergence actually means. And we're going to talk about how the church can be welcoming to all people. So, okay. So my first question to you all is, why are you here? Are you here because it's Tuesday night Bible study? Are you here because you love someone who is neurodivergent? Are you here because you have no idea what this word means and I keep saying it? That okay. Appreciate that. You didn't have a choice. They brought you here. James. Ooh, teaching public school. That's a great reason. Yeah. 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 Awesome. Yeah. Ooh, that's a great reason to be here. Excellent. Yeah. 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 People in our families. We're almost there. Mm. Interesting. Yes. Yeah, thanks for bringing up sleep apnea. I think this is interesting because this is obviously new to a lot of us, I think, in studying, but I will even say like the some of the language we're going to talk about here in a minute is stuff that like wasn't even talked about like when I graduated college, which was like a while ago, but not that long ago. So a lot of this is just new understanding and understanding this kind of the intersection between physiology and psychology, which we won't totally get to. Great. I think next slide, maybe one more. Yeah, we can go to the next one. So this is a quote from Emily Van Cleek. This is somebody who was a guest speaker in one of my CPE courses. She is a quadriplegic, and she acquired that through an injury when she was 22. And she wrote a really great article that I'm happy to share with anybody who's interested, but this is one of her quotes from it, but just talking about how the church can be welcoming. And this is somewhere where I want to get. But we won't dwell here long, but just the idea that Christ welcomed. We see that in throughout the gospel. And so the church is just invited to have a sense of welcome and accessibility. Go ahead and go to the next one. I just don't want to spend too long there because we need to know what we're talking about here. So Neurodiversity 101, we're going to switch over to this one, to this glossary handout. And just so you know, that symbol there, the rainbow infinity symbol, is a neurodiversity symbol. So that's why it's there. It's not just because it's pretty and colorful. But so neurodiversity, and you can go to one more slide ahead. We're going to define these 4 terms. It is a little bit small, but I can zoom in here. Yeah, it's an eye test. So the first thing we're talking about is neurodiversity. So if you look at these terms, they all start with neuro. Neurodiversity is the idea that all of our, neuro meaning brain, so diversity is just that all of our brains are different, right? And so we have the neurodiversity as like a concept is just this perspective that we see that difference as value, and we see that, and we understand now through science that this is just like a naturally occurring thing in a lot of cases. And so we just kind of welcome that, and we can, if we start from that place, we can start from a place of understanding. So then neurodivergent means that it's a brain that diverges, that is different from basic society standards. Like, and well, the next one is neurotypical. And so typical, normal, those aren't like super great words, but we know that like there is a standard or an expectation or a most of how brains work. So it's just the terms are comparing it to like what is typical, what is normal. So we got neurodivergent, which is different from standards. Neurotypical is one that functions relatively within normal limits.
Does this mean, when you talk about neurodivergent, does this mean that you take an input in, the brain takes an input in, and people don't process that input the same way, so therefore you get a different spectrum of results.
Ooh, yeah, I wish you had a microphone. That was a really good explanation. So what Bill was saying is that if you're neurodivergent, when you take information in, the way your brain processes it is different from the way somebody else might process it.
Well, what I'm saying is on a scope or a scale, you have an input, but the output that comes out of that is on a spectrum. And so part of that spectrum would be considered normal, outside of that spectrum would not be considered.
Yes, there is a spectrum of what is normal. Yeah, and that's again where we, like trying to put, like if you wanted to categorize everyone into neurodivergent and neurotypical, like that is going to be an arbitrary 2 buckets. Because, and we're going to talk about that too, but for a lot of these things, they're moving towards definitions that include language about a spectrum, because it's not just you have it or you don't, but like the way it impacts you is going to be different. Yeah.
So you've got 4 definitions.
Mm-hmm.
We fall into one of those 4, or we could be tending towards one and still have a little bit of the other.
Kind of. So these aren't like 4 different things, these are kind of overlapping topics. So neurodiversity is just the idea that everyone in this room's brain functions differently. We could be presented with things and it's going to be different. Neurodivergent and neurotypical are 2 categories, if you will, of like if your brain functions typically or if your brain doesn't function in that same way. So those are the 2 categories you could, but that's not super helpful.
Right.
And then
That's why I brought up the question, because I think we all have diversity in the neuro mind.
Right, right, because and that's what I'm saying is like, this is language to kind of help us get some sort of grounding to talk about this stuff, but it's also meta and it's also, we're trying to put the brain into a box, and if we know anything, we know that we know very little about the brain. Yeah.
That was my point.
Yeah.
These are just terms that are used.
Yes. So that way you know, if I'm talking about neurotypical, then you have some idea of what we're talking about.
But being neurotypical could be really broad.
Yeah.
In spectrum.
Right.
So it could be, there's not just a defined line with that.
Right.
It's broad in that spectrum. And the neurodivergent would also be broad in that spectrum.
Right. And it'll help as we get through like some examples of what those neurodivergences are. And that's what neurodivergence is. It's the specific diagnosis or the symptom. You might have to skip ahead a little bit, Vanessa, on the slides, because I think there's some, yeah, it's going to bold it, so it's easier to look at. But that's okay. I didn't have a clicker. So neurodiversity is the big topic. Okay. And this is just another Bible verse. Like when we're talking about this, the whole idea of this neurodiversity is when we're talking about these differences, we are recognizing that everybody has different gifts, but they are all valuable. I think a lot of times people who are neurodivergent have experienced the world saying that you have a problem or a deficiency, and even the Bible has a lot of that language and language when talking about disabilities. And so we are entering this because we have the benefit of knowledge of a little bit more about how brains work. We're coming at this to say that like everyone has different gifts. Okay. I feel like we're doing a good job of y'all are speaking up and asking questions when you have them, and I love that, so keep that. But does anybody have any questions?
Well, I mean, I think I still don't really understand, but I guess we'll get to it.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
I mean, I understand. I guess I don't know. I'm a numbers logic guy, so I need some like real world examples.
Well, and let's.
What I'm getting at. Yeah, probably.
You're a numbers logic guy, right?
Yeah.
How are you with that?
Not well.
There you go. It's the input, output.
You are a neurodivergent.
It's your wiring.
Yeah.
It's like, you just want me to do fine arts and paint something on a wall? No, I tried to learn, I did calculus first.
Yeah.
And we've always, for years, we've called that left brain and right brain.
Ooh,
But
yeah.
It's more complicated.
Right. That's a good example of the left brain versus. James, sorry, did you have a question
Does
there?
neurodivergence tend to present itself at any particular age group? Does it happen over time? Does it happen when you're born? What do we know about that?
Ooh, nice. So James's question is, and tell me if I'm getting it wrong, but is neurodivergence something that we see in a certain age group, Or is it something that happens over time? So at its most basic level, when we talk about neurodiversity, we can talk about how the brain is when we are born. Like there are certain things that are genetic that we get from our brains. There's a lot of these that we're going to talk about the specifics. If you look on the back of this handout, there's a box and it lists out some examples that might be helpful for us to kind of talk through right now, because it might help us kind of orient a little bit better. But when we talk about things like ADHD or autism, those are things that are, we understand them to be things that are genetic. Those are things that we see, we might not see the symptoms of until they get a little bit older, but it's part of how the brain is made up. We have other things that come later in life, such as like PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. That is something where the brain chemistry actually changes in response to trauma. And so then, when you talk about like receiving things, the way that the brain processes new information is different as a result of going through this trauma. So it's kind of a both. Like a lot of this stuff is innate in us or has a genetic marker or something like that. But then there are things that can trigger things later in life. Like, sorry, George, go ahead.
Based on what you just said, for all of these conditions, and you have a list of them here, and I agree that they're not all,
Right.
to cover most of them. Do we know why they happen in each case? And as you just said, the brain functions this way, because I'm sure that there are things that you inherit, and or maybe over time your brain reacts to them. But there's also, I'm sure, things that, particularly in children as they grow up, for instance, if they're abused, it's one, they grow up one way with their brains function differently.
It's,
I didn't see all of this if you weren't syndrome.
yeah. Well, okay, and so a couple things. So like, why does this happen? We don't know. And I really don't know. I mean, there are researchers who spend their entire lives studying why does this happen, what causes it. There are theories and they're tested. That is enormously complex for any one of these to be able to say why it happens. Because yeah, and you can look at things like, autism spectrum disorders is one that is known to have a genetic component. But that doesn't mean that everyone in the family is going to have autism. It just means that there's a higher likelihood. And again, we're talking about the complexities of DNA and genes that I will not even pretend to understand, even at a basic level. So we don't know why. And I feel like there's a second part of something you said that I don't remember now. Oh, syndrome.
So that's the problem, because a syndrome is by definition something we don't know what causes it. And so it's, and the problem with many of these conditions, as I understand it, is that they may mimic each other, but have entirely different conditions, different causes.
Right. Well, and like you can look at, so there's a difference, right? And we're going to talk about the difference between disability and neurodivergence, right? Because they're not mutually exclusive terms. But like you can look at some of the symptoms of, and I'm just like going back to ADHD and autism because those are two I'm really familiar with. There's a lot of overlap, and you look at the presentation of those, especially when you look at adults. But there's entirely different reasons for why that's happening. And so for somebody with autism, and I stuck in the sensory stuff, there's some people who are sensory seeking, who like it helps them get to baseline if they have a lot of sensory, lots of lights and lights of sounds. I have his permission. Sam has ADHD. I always say he's kind of like a textbook character of ADHD. But like he does best working when he's got a video playing and he's like got lights on and all sorts of stuff. I actually have autism spectrum disorders, and I do best when I have really low like sensory input. I have noise canceling headphones and I keep my lights dimmer because that can overwhelm me. But those are two different like sensory things for different reasons. But they're, I know, we really balance each other. I will tell you, our house between like 4 p.m. and 6 p.m. when dinner is being prepared and cooked, I've got my noise canceling in and he's got all the things playing, but we balance each other out. But yes, and that's the other thing is like there's a lot of overlap. And again, these are kind of arbitrary boxes that we kind of try to put ourselves into. And what I think is helpful about them is they give us a way to describe our experiences. It is helpful for me to understand my experience through the context of autism because it helps me understand why I do the things that I do, right? It helps me understand why am I getting overwhelmed when the dishes are being put away. Okay, well, I know that it's sensory and now I can do something about that. But there's a lot of overlap.
So some of these can be internal, what it causes genetic or whatever, and then some of them can be external, like the PTSD, which would be, or the alcohol syndrome, the fetal alcohol syndrome, where it's from an outside source.
Right.
So
yeah.
it can be either way, part of it.
Right, and it gets even more complex because somebody who is born with fetal alcohol syndrome, and that's where like a mother or father prenatally consumes a large enough amount of alcohol. We don't know what the amount is, but it affects the development. So somebody could be born with fetal alcohol, it's called syndrome or spectrum disorders. They could be born with that and also have an anxiety disorder, unrelated. Or they could also grow up, experience trauma, and then also have PTSD. So there's also like compounding things here, right? We talk about dyslexia, right? Dyslexia is it's a written language processing disorder.
Yes, neurological is language processing of your brain. So when you read it, they see it differently than someone like you say who might have but they did brain scans, so there is difference. So some of like children's trauma, when I was doing social work, Bruce Perry is he's an expert on this, but they did scans, and kids who experience trauma, their cortical areas that has a higher level thinking is less developed than like the part of your brain that controls your emotions and impulses and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
They're like in a fight or flight, and so their reasoning, the cortical area is less developed, so they don't always make enough decisions.
Yeah.
So your brain,
so interesting.
So different things, either born or environment can change, especially in children. When your brain's being developed can change those areas of your brain and how much gets developed.
And that's the other two parts of it, right? There's what you can see. You can see a child who's struggling to read, but then there's also like brain scans that actually show the differences in the brain, which obviously we don't always have access to. It's interesting. Other question?
I guess, I was thinking about, for some reason I've read a lot about Howard Hughes, and it just came to my mind. In other words, it's something, from what I know about him, it manifested very late in life.
Like, I don't know Howard Hughes.
Well, so he was like, I think the first billionaire.
Elon said no.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and so he was oil, and he had a lot of money, and he was in Hollywood making pictures, and like little things, little kind of obsessive compulsive things started showing up, and it got worse and worse.
Yeah.
So it was a point that, he's the richest man in the world, and he sat there naked in a room watching TV all day. Like
Never wanted his fingernails cut.
yeah, didn't want his finger, and he had all these weird things about cut. But he wasn't always that way. It happened, I think, like his 40s or 50s. This all started.
Yeah.
So I assume it can kind of be latent.
Absolutely. Yeah. Like things can present at any point, and things can also exacerbate it, right? Like if I am overwhelmed and stressed because it's finals week, guess what? I'm going to be even more sensitive to bright lights and loud sounds. Like, and also, for a lot of these, there's a lot of treatment that can help. Like PTSD is one that, like, with therapeutic intervention, you can really get on top of those symptoms, and you can work on those things so that it doesn't affect your life as much. But for a lot of schizophrenia, PTSD, personality disorders, like if those are not treated, then they can become more disabling because you don't have strategies to deal with them, and they can kind of take over.
Well, from the college class, I think what we're talking about a little bit is your synapse rate is changing. The rate that the neurons are firing and connecting with each other, being the stimulus is changing it. It changes, it affects the process.
Right. Well, we know that the brain is plastic. Like it can change over time, which means that it can get worse and new things can pop up and that. But it also means that it can heal. And we also know that like when you talk about synapses, that's like the pathways that things go through your brain, and the paths that are most used are the quickest. So like if things have always gone this way, it's going to go really quickly that way, which is why change is so hard. Okay. Other questions before we move on?
Dyslexics of the world untied.
The what?
Dyslexics of the world untied.
Untie?
United.
Oh. Well, you can see.
When did this, I mean, this is a very comprehensive, but still not exhaustive list of things that, when I was growing up, we maybe knew the guy wasn't with it.
Right.
We have gone so far in a relatively short period of time coming up with this, because it happened before. You either went to crazy house or we had institutions, insignificant, whatever you had.
Right.
Until, when did this become really hot? When did this become very,
So-
or at least clear? I mean, PTSD, which is one of the ones that I think World War II,
Yeah.
particularly men, but nurses too, women, came back and never talked about it. Just
Right.
did not talk about it. And there was lots of suicide, there was lots of alcoholism, there were lots of things that happened in the 50s and 60s after World War II because they weren't recognized.
Right.
Today we're better at recognizing this. When did that really flip?
So, I mean, we're talking about the history of disabilities here, right? And so when we talk about PTSD specifically, it was first called shell shock. They didn't know, but they knew that people coming back from war had changed, right? We've been describing human behavior for as long as humans have been around. I mean, and I don't remember what, I also have celiac disease. I got a whole laundry list, right? I've got celiac disease, and there's like really ancient writings about people having reactions to bread. Like, it's been around for a long time. No, that's a disability, yeah. Right. But just to say that we've been talking about stuff for a long time. So the DSM is the diagnostic something manual. Sorry, I don't know. But it's basically a book of all of these disorders, what the symptomology is of each one. And it's like, okay, in order to be diagnosed with this, you have to have this, this, and this, and one of these three things, or whatever it is for each one. That was in part put into place for insurance purposes, which is like a really lame but makes sense.
60s, 70s?
I couldn't tell you a year. Yeah.
I'm glad we know it. I'm glad we can identify this because it helps us look at people differently. And also, in my opinion, accept people differently.
Right. Well, and
you know that
right.
they are here.
Right. And when we just think, so when we think about like most people having, and we're going to get to this too, but like when we think about most people are neurotypical, it creates this expectation for behavior. When you all came in here, you came in, some of you grabbed a handout, but you came in and sat down. There's something, you knew that we were going to be, you saw other people sitting, so you kind of came close, but you didn't sit right next to somebody unless that was the person you were with. Like there's all these like social rules that we all just kind of know and expect. But if somebody, besides my 2-year-old, came up here and did what he was doing, and was walking up and down the stage and playing loudly with toys and they were an adult, you would think, something's not right with them. Maybe you would be uncomfortable. Maybe you would think, wow, they shouldn't be doing that, or why aren't they sitting down, right? But then as we start to understand, like, oh, okay, well, maybe that person has like some sort of developmental disability. Then we can start to say, then we can like change our expectations, right? And recognize that like, okay, are they doing anything malicious? But like, it's just, it goes against our grain because we don't even think about it when we come in that we're gonna come and sit in these chairs and do these things. So then it's weird when somebody does something that like we don't expect. So that's where I think we have the opportunity to build empathy, right? And we talk about the church, right? How do we make this place welcoming to people where they don't feel comfortable coming in and sitting down in a chair or, you know, like these are just things for us to think about, but it's good.
But I think the answer to your question is when did the subject become so hot? I think that's in the future. I have a feeling that with the advances we're making in the study of human genes and the microchemistry that goes on in the human body and the synapses and what have you, we're just beginning to get a grasp of that, and when we do so more fully, then we will begin to get answers to these questions like in avalanches.
Yeah, I think you're right. I do think we're early in a way, and we're also, I mean, there's lots of years of studying too.
So, Christy, I was just thinking about like, you know, alcohol and addictions and stuff. I assume that plays, because, I mean, some people can have a drink and put it down. Some people just drink until they pass out. I assume that's plays in.
I think so. So addiction is a really interesting topic, and I'm not super qualified to say whether or not that is a neurodivergence or whatever, but we know that we do recognize that, yeah, some people have a tendency towards addiction, and some do not.
And some of it's genetic.
And I like the word tendency because, okay, I have a sister and a son and now a nephew with brain cancer, and it's not genetic, but the neurosurgeons have finally come and said there can be a familial tendency, which is a weakness somewhere or some, you know, in your body somewhere that makes you more susceptible. And I think that the same thing with alcoholism. I think there's a familial tendency. It's not genetic.
Right. Yes. And we know that if you have ADHD, you are at a significantly higher likelihood for dealing with addiction because of the way that so ADHD is an imbalance of neurotransmitters and chemicals in your brain, and so that's why for Sam, he could drink a whole load of caffeine, wouldn't affect him, and he could go to bed, because the caffeine is just bringing him up to baseline, what other people's brains are at a normal time. So that caffeine's not adding extra, it's just getting up to baseline. So it might help focus. That's why they prescribe stimulants for people with ADHD, which seems counterintuitive.
Down to normal.
Right. It balances it out. Right. But before that reason, there's a higher chance of addiction.
Are most of these things found out as a child? I mean, do they start to see these things as a child?
I would say for some of these, when we talk about ADHD, when we talk about autism, even to some extent anxiety and depression can pop up. Those are a little bit more complicated. Epilepsy can pop up at different times. Tourette's is usually childhood. Fetal alcohol syndrome's at birth. PTSD can be anytime. OCD, dyslexia, you're not going to see that until they start trying to read, right? So it's complicated. And then there's also compounding things of, talk about that diagnostic criteria. Well, for a big part of history, this is just now starting to change. Most of the diagnostic criteria was based off of white men and boys. And so we see there's a high, there's a lot of people, especially, again, I know ADHD and autism the best, right? They're really commonly missed in girls. And so there's more women with those tend to get diagnosed later in life because it presents differently. And it's very complicated.
Same thing with dyslexia. People think it happens more often in boys. It doesn't. Just it presents. Boys will usually act out more with the frustration not being able to read. Girls usually try to
internalize.
Go radar.
Yes.
So it's like training my teachers on how to recognize it, and boys and girls, I'll just focus on the ones who are acting out. Like those are the ones who are trying to go below the radar. So it presents itself differently in boys and girls.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah.
But now today also, we have a tendency to group people. I mean, bipolar seems to be the one, the catchphrase, if they have some kind of divergent attitude away, they're bipolar. And,
right.
And it may not be, and there are very specifics about bipolar, but now we have a tendency to categorize people that way, to say they must be bipolar.
And there's definitely trends that happen with that. And not to really hark on this, but part of it is insurance and funding, right? So if doctors are going to get reimbursed for higher diagnosis rate. That happened with ADHD. There was a time where you had a whole bunch of kids, if they acted out, then it was probably ADHD, and they were put on medication. And that's I think, George, what you were saying is that like this is coming in the future. I think we're getting there, right? Like language is really limiting, but I think we're getting closer to being able to understand what is really going on and what people actually need in order to be able to function more fully, right? And that's a big part of the, journey for a lot of people with neurodivergence, is figuring out what they need. If they need medication to help them level off so that they can, function without that burden. Or if it's about building in strategies. I worked with kids with autism who were non-speaking. And so in order to communicate, we gave them computer tablets that had language systems in there so that could be their voice for them. Because a lot of their behavior frustration was rooted in not being able to communicate. So sometimes finding out what people need. And that whether it's medication or strategies or therapy, a lot of those things take time to figure out. And I think that's where, as the church, we can be partners for people, and if we can be empathetic for people and be support people for them, as they go through these things, as they are trying to figure out what do they need, we can help them. Or if we're going through that ourselves, we can lean on.
You gotta go on PD, ask your doctor.
Yeah. Will you go to the next slide? Okay. These are, I think we've talked on a lot of these. I don't know what I meant by neurodiversity, because we've been talking about that. Maybe I had something in mind. But spectrums, we talked about that, right? So spectrum is the idea that it's not just you have this or you have that. Maybe if we spend more time on another night talking about autism, I can show you. There's some different representations of spectrums. So there might be 6 or 7 categories of symptoms that might present: communication difficulties, sensory, anxieties, fixations, right? So you might have these different categories of symptoms, and each person with autism is going to have a different level within each of those that's going to make them unique, right? So spectrums is a better way to understand all of symptomology, really. And then, yeah, and I think tonight we're really going to get oriented, and I think in the next couple of sessions we can spend some time looking at some of these specific ones, and look at what does it look like to have OCD? What does that really mean?
So when they say somebody has a low case of it, or it just means that they're low on that spectrum range, that you can go from that where you're barely affected by it all the way to where it's totally disabled.
Right, and even more granular than that within each symptom group, right? Because it's not just, and that's, so if you go back to this handout actually, and you go to the back, there's a whole section here about functioning level labels and severity, and this is also a new, a recent kind of language shift, because we used to talk about people being high functioning and low functioning, which gives you a picture maybe of how typical they are, but it's not a super helpful language, because it just kind of reduces it down again, so there is a language shift. I've heard a lot of people talking about more about support needs, so saying if somebody has really high support needs or low support needs, but all of that to say that there is a variety in function. There's a variety in how much support someone needs, but it's not always helpful to. We don't want to risk saying, oh well, they're high functioning anxiety, so they're fine. It becomes a little dismissive, and it puts people into a binary that's not really there, because likely somebody with an anxiety disorder, sometimes their anxiety is really high and sometimes it's really low, and for different reasons too.
And I think the problem also lies in that sometimes when you say, well, he has a high level of this or a low level, they have entirely different conditions.
Right.
And that's why I say that since we don't know the causes for all these things, we make assumptions that if it looks like this, we treat it like picture, knowing the causes, then of course everything else will fall into place much better.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the causes would be, I mean, to be able to know what causes something is great, would be great insight. And I've heard it say, like, if you judge a fish on its ability to climb a tree, you'll think it's dumb, right? Like, so, I mean, again, trying to put like arbitrary expectations on people when we don't really know like how they are experiencing whatever it is, and like how big of an impact it, I mean, I'm sure you know, Lori, working with kids, but how much, if you make a change in somebody's environment, how big of a change that can help for them. I mean, there's fonts that are designed to be easier for the dyslexic mind to read, and so there are things we can do, and that kind of gets to the fourth bullet point on there is social model. And this is getting into like disability and neurodivergence, because we're kind of bouncing between the two. But the social model of disability is the idea that people are only disabled because the world is not built for them. If we actually have a pretty accessible building for somebody in a wheelchair, for instance, and even our stage has a ramp. But a lot of places you go to, there are stairs and steps to get into. And so like, they are disabled because of the limitations of buildings and the environment. And if you go to one more slide, this is the overlap between neurodivergence and disability. So disability is something that impacts the way that you are functioning in life. If you can have any one of these neurodiversities, but not necessarily be disabled. But you could have depression that was so intense, for lack of a better word, that you are unable to get out of bed, that you are unable to do your basic care tasks, that you are unable to cook for yourself, right? That is a neurodivergence that is also a disability. There are also disabilities that are not necessarily neurodivergence, right? I have celiac disease. That can be disabling, but it has nothing to do with my brain, although there is some overlap, but we won't go there. Yeah, we'll talk about it offline, the after session. We'll get into, yeah. So I think that's important for us to keep in mind, because we're going to be talking about both. And as we look at the Bible, there was not language to talk about neurodivergence, right? Jesus did not say like, oh, I'm going to help you with coping strategies for your neurodivergence. That's not there. There's not even language about disability. So we're applying new language, new understanding to a text that doesn't have those things. But I think it's important just to recognize that we're kind of focusing on neurodivergence because of like the neurodiversity view, but just know that there's going to be overlap with disability topics. Okay, what's the next slide? Okay, this is a good, so this is a quote again from Emily Van Cleek from her article. And it says, whether through birth, accident, or age, we all face the inevitability of disability, and we should be prepared to bear each other's burdens and fulfill the law of Christ through welcoming accessibility. There is an idea that if we are able-bodied, it is only temporary. Because at some point we will have an injury, whether temporary or permanent, that will cause us to be disabled. And at the end of it all, the aging process itself has moments of being disabling. And so, not that we should do something only because it's going to affect us too, but it is more motivating. And I think it's important that we recognize that for ourselves, but also for the people that we are in community with. When you think about marriage, for an example, right? There's a high likelihood that your partner will at some point face disability, and so that you will also become a caregiver. And so that is a different role, a different task, and I think as the church, I think we do that really well, actually, but it's just important and we think about that not just for disability, but for diversity. Go to the next slide. Okay. So that brings us to the list, which we've kind of been going between. I don't think we're going to, because I think we only have like 10 or 15 minutes left. I don't think we're going to dive in to any of these specifically tonight. I think we'll save that for future weeks of kind of going into like really what these look like, what kind of maybe what our expectations or what we kind of know about them and maybe how those things are different. So let's actually go to, and you can go to the next slide, but let's finish out talking about this handout. If we can take it, some more language, some more terminology. On the front page under the stick figures is the section about person first versus identity first language. So I will tell you, when I was in college, it was person first language everywhere, meaning I would say a person with autism and not an autistic person, okay? So person with is person first language, a person with OCD, a person with dyslexia, versus identity first language, which is saying an autistic person, an ADHD person. It's grammatically kind of weird. But this person first language was developed by academics. And it sounds really nice, and it sounds like you're putting people's personhood first. But what we found is that if we listen to people who are disabled, if we listen to people who are autistic and are neurodivergent, they prefer identity first language because it is not something, I've heard people say, I can't take it off, so just like there's no reason to dance around it. And I've heard that for both disabled folks as well as neurodivergent folks.
Kind of like wearing the label.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Wearing the label.
It seems like a lot of this parallels with sexuality.
Yeah.
The idea that sexuality itself can be considered a neurodivergence because you are acting out in a different way than the world is expecting you to.
Right.
But it's also the identity versus person first stuff that I think is an important piece that we often, those of us who might not understand fully what that other person, how they prefer to be identified and stuff like that, I think it's an important piece that works there too.
It's interesting. There's a ton of parallels. And what I was going to say about neurodivergence and disability also applies to sexuality and gender, is that at the end of the day, people are not just one group. And so there's people who have different opinions on what they want to be called. As far as, like, there are some people who would be offended if you called them autistic, and there are some people who would be offended if you called them a person with autism, right? There's also really interesting high correlation between people who are neurodivergent and people who are in the LGBTQ community as well. There's a high correlation between people who are in the LGBTQ community as well as people who are neurodivergent. I've recently heard a definition of queer in the terms of sexuality, being somebody who's going against the grains and expectations, which is really similar to what we understand from neurodivergence.
About this person first and identity first, I have had someone say to me, I don't want to be identified by my diversion.
Yeah.
Now, would that be a person who wanted person first versus identity? You know?
It sounds like it, or George just said maybe neither. And it's probably, for most of us, it's probably very rare that we are going to be talking about other people's neurodivergence. Now, when we are professionals working with children or diagnosing or writing reports, we're going to have to use that language because it's super relevant. But us talking about other people's neurodivergence is probably not as common.
So do we just take a cue from the person?
Yeah, and I would say if you're talking with somebody and you get to that point where you're about to say either person with or, and you're kind of stuck between, just say, hey, how would you like me to talk about this? What kind of language do you want me to use regarding this?
And just take your cue from them.
Yeah, and also it's helpful to see, if you have the opportunity, see how they introduce themselves to other people and how they disclose that information to other people.
I mean, I think that would help us not only just in social, but here at church.
Right.
When we deal with someone.
Yeah, and this is also something that, like, we don't always get the benefit of people sharing that with us. And so I think when we do, I think it's good that we, can say, like, thank you for sharing that with me. How can I support you? I will say that the office here knows I'm not good with sarcasm. And so I have been able to voice that, and it has saved us a lot of miscommunications. Susie one time told me that she gave somebody a heart attack, and I thought she was serious and was very concerned. It took a second, we got there. But I think being able to have relationships with people where they feel comfortable saying, like, this is something that I need. This is a way that I feel supported. I think that is huge when it comes to being in community with people.
Is it become more open today? Is the discussion, I mean,
Yeah.
people hid. I mean, for years and
Yeah.
years and years, people hid
What a
those
good-
versions.
What a great segue. The next section I wanted to go to is the did you know on the back of this. And it's the topic of masking, which is exactly that. I will say that, like, for me as especially as a woman with autism, and I can look through my whole life and see the ways in which that has impacted my life. But most people are surprised, and I'm sure some of you were surprised to hear that, because I'm really good at masking. At least I think so. Sam might think differently. But masking is the idea.
Where are you?
I told him, I said, if anybody, he would say, she definitely is. But masking is the idea of, like, I know the rules, right? Like just like we talked about coming in here, like, we know that we're gonna sit and we're gonna, maybe have a chair or two between people if we're not with them, or like all of these, like, subconscious things that, like, you can figure out. Most people learn them really implicitly. Like, they just learn them because that's just what you do and that's what everybody else is doing. For other people, you have to learn it really explicitly. I kind of,
It's not your preference. Your preference would be to not use
right. Yeah, like
it.
if
Your natural behavior, your natural preference would be to use it.
something
And
different.
walk around it.
Right. And none of us really know what that is, because masking my whole life impacts the way that I view social settings now. And the way that the things that go through my head that I, like, consciously think about that other people probably don't, is different. But I can't undo that. And that's another place where we are so neurodiverse, because nobody can even, I call Sam a textbook, case of ADHD. He's not really, because what is that? The ways that we experience that are influenced, again, by the intersection of multiple things, right? I am different because I went to school for speech language pathology and literally studied the rules of communication and social interaction so that I could teach others about it, right? I'm different because of that. I'm different because of the other neurodivergencies, the other disabilities I have. Those all impact us and change who we are.
It's greatly affected by experience.
Yes, and I say that the way that it presents is so different based on experience.
But you as teachers have to be hindered by parents that want to hide this. I remember my mother, who was a teacher for a zillion years, knew that a kid had a problem, but the parents did not want to hear it.
Right, and now we're getting worse because dyslexia has now moved under special education. It used to be what's called private school pathway. It is now moved under special education, because so that carries another stigma. And so a lot of parents are now not wanting their kids to have that label, and so it's harder to get parents to sign off on consent to test. So we're facing that right now. I mean, there's a lot of denial, like, oh, it was fine. I'm like, well, no, they need, poor things, they just need help. And once they see they get help and they get the confidence, they're okay, but to get the parents initially to, because you can't test a kid without consent. And now that it's such a special ed, it's presenting another layer.
I
barrier,
remember when
even.
our kids were in
And
elementary
so that's why it's like
school.
trying to get people, like you say, to see this as a more, like you say, just you need support. Like I tell my kids, you have all these strengths. We're going to build on your strengths, but there's just one area that you need help with. It's fine. You know, that unfortunately special education has such a negative stigma, and we're trying to change that. And the schools are trying to be more inclusive and trying to change that. So I appreciate you trying to change it in the community, because I see the schools trying to change that.
I remember when my kids were in grade school, the talk was Ritalin.
Yeah.
Who's on Ritalin? Everybody's
Yeah.
on Ritalin. You know, it was like that's the answer to the whole world was going to be Ritalin, because all these kids are all, you know, all whacked out on stuff. But parents then were hiding it.
Right.
So because they didn't want their kid to be
Right.
on Ritalin and have that,
Right.
that stigma to it.
And if parents are, we can't give services unless parents sign off. So there's a lot of kids who might not get the support, whether it's dyslexia or ADHD or autism, whatever. There might be kids out there who have these things that if the parents aren't getting support, we cannot provide services. And that's,
Well, and the flip side of that too is you're not supposed to diagnose unless you are trained
Right.
in how to appropriately go through the
right, so
process.
it's diagnostician. So
Yeah.
when a kid that we go to meetings and I'm a service provider, not the diagnostician, but they can't even test, like they can't test the kids unless they get the consent. So I can't even, they can't even say, well, where can you help this kid? I can't unless the parents have signed off on it.
Yeah, and so the stigma, which is a rolling thing, it changes, like what has stigma, but there is a lot of stigma about disability broadly.
Disability what?
Disability broadly. So disability and neurodivergence, but I mean all of it, right? There are stigmas that come with it. And when we look at the Bible, that is one of the challenges we have as we read scriptures talking about this, is that in that time, there was a cultural understanding that if you had a disability, it is because of sin. And that is a hard thing for us to reconcile, and it's a hard thing for us to,
Sin or demon possession.
yes.
Was there any point in the Bible where we got over that?
No.
Or the Bible was in...
Jesus, there was a kid clearly having an epileptic seizure, and Jesus cast out a demon.
So everything was doomed, basically.
So we never got away from the...
Not in the Bible.
Okay, that's my...
Which probably,
How many years ago?
Yeah, I know.
that's-
yeah, I mean, it would.
Well, and
given-
I always think too, so like when we look at the creation stories, right? The creation story does not tell us about atoms and black holes and stars and all of the things that we have learned about now, right? Because there was like, we only have the language we have access to at the time. And our culture significantly impacts the ways that we understand these, the way that we treat people. And so I think it's really important that we're really conscious of that as we start talking about some of these, some of the texts that deal with this. And hopefully that we as a church community, as a part of the bigger community, can be people who can help destigmatize these things so that people truly do feel welcome, and so that we can help people that they feel welcome here at church, but also, you know, comfortable in who they are, because we know that God created all of us. And it is a joy when we understand that God created us. Like, God truly understands us and understands the ways that our brain works when it seems like it's working for us and against us. God understands that, and God is with us through that. So there's hope in that, and there's hope that we can share with others.
It's amazing, when you said culture, culture is so divergent. So until you begin to have an exposure, you have no idea how divergent.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a whole tangent there, right? I mean, in the ways that different cultures view neurodivergence and talk about masking and hiding things, because some things are not appropriate to do in certain, and that goes as far as like individual families, right? Individual families have lots of like cultural rules about, you know, I mean, are you a family where if you bring a cell phone to the table, you're in trouble? I mean, are you a family who have the TV on while you're, you know, eating dinner? Like, there are so many different rules, and like the way, like, I read a story recently about a kiddo who had ADHD, and mom was like, okay, you need to sit down at the dining room table because that's where we do homework. You need to sit there and do your homework. Well, the kid didn't get their homework done. What they were doing before they got told to go to the table is they were sitting on the floor in front of the TV while doing their homework. Well, for that individual kid, that's actually better. That seems ridiculous to some of us. Seems ridiculous to me. I can't do that. I can't focus that way. I can't even listen to music with words on. Absolutely. And I consider being married to someone of a different neurodivergence to be such a joy and a gift, because I see like, oh wow, our brains are very different, and yet we get it done. It is a blessing.
I think part of that comes from, though, the hiding and stuff comes from a place of being told that if you're different, you need to fix yourself.
Yes.
So that you can conform.
Yes.
And part of this whole conversation is that we need to be a church that tells people that you are welcome here without fixing yourself. Because we all carry this divergent from God's will, which is sin, and it's not us who fixes that, it's God who fixes that.
Right.
And so we welcome all people just as they are, recognizing that God created them a certain way, and God doesn't say to them, you need to fix yourself before you can be loved and lovable.
And the
Yes.
challenge with that in our current U.S., maybe some other place in the U.S., is we have decided to become less tolerant and more yes or no instead of being accommodating, right? So it's just,
I would argue completely opposite of what you just said.
okay, maybe I misspoke.
That we are more tolerant now and more educated and more willing to understand others now than we've ever been in my lifetime.
I would agree with that.
ADA brought it to,
different worlds, I mean, in different parts of the world, we may be less tolerant politically, but I think we are more ready to at least listen to the stuff
Ooh,
about
I
everything.
wish. So that's a bigger discussion,
Yeah.
because I think we've learned a lot more, but we're getting less educated, and we've become much more, it's this way or that way. There is no more, let's have a conversation.
Well, so some of what you're talking about is this, like, putting things into binaries, of like, and especially when we talk about neurodivergence, is putting any of these in, right, versus going into like a spectrum understanding. And so I think that's something that's been happening for a long time, of trying to, and we are people who like to be able to understand things. It is convenient when we can put things into categories, right? It was like Luther's paradoxes were so mind-blowing, because it was like, oh, you can be a Saint and a sinner. Like, those things can both be true. Like, that's, right? We have a hard time with the nuance.
Tim, I think that's a very generational way of seeing things. I think there's a certain generation that grew up in a certain way, and they're not really open to, but the generations behind
Okay,
grew
I'm
up in a
with you on
different
that.
world.
It's a point of time view also. It's a point of time of view, but not broken down by the generation, which I agree with you on that. And that's why this is, for me, this is unbelievably thought-provoking, because I've dealt with this within my company for years, because my company was just very accepting to all this. So it was just ingrained in my life for 40 years. But then I go to other places, this is totally unacceptable. So
Well, and that's where, I mean,
that's where you grow up, in a different place, at different time.
well, that's why when the ADA, the American Disabilities Act was brought in, nobody knew what to do with it.
Yeah, right, right.
How late was that?
Companies were dying with this.
1993.
Companies were literally dying. They did not want to know what to do. I mean, I worked with Marriott, and Marriott was trying to figure out how they could put lifts by every single swimming pool in every hotel, because they had to comply with ADA, and they had to have the ability to take a handicapped person, be able to put them in the pool. So they were spending millions of dollars on these lifts, but nobody knew how to run them.
yeah.
And so, I mean, it's just,
Go to 24-hour fitness. They've got one. It doesn't work, but
yeah, I mean, yeah, so I think all of this is kind of just,
Isn't that why we're here? I mean,
to learn
We're
and
here to learn what we can do as a church
right.
to be more accepting and welcoming
Yeah.
to, you know, so that everybody can come in and be part of worship and feel comfortable in their own way of doing things. And
Yeah.
so,
Well, just a discussion
yeah,
broadens,
Yeah.
broadens
Exactly.
your knowledge and your potential acceptance or understanding of the diversity across the spectrum.
And
Yes.
I'm glad
Pastor
you
Crosby.
didn't say the word tolerant, because it's so easy to say we're tolerant with it, right? We have to accept it.
Well, and yeah, like what Carol said about
That's
being
what I mean,
about
Carol,
being
that
welcoming.
I was
Yeah.
waiting for you to say tolerant, and you did not. And I think we often say, I'll be tolerant with it. I'll accept it and just accept it begrudgingly, which we do.
Pastor Kathy, were you gonna say something?
I have a very neurodivergent son. And my two kids, who are amazingly brilliant, one has a PhD in history and the other has a master's degree in mechanical engineering. We learned early on that they are highly dyslexic. One more than the other, but highly dyslexic. Once I learned what that meant, I realized that I am too.
Isn't that funny? Like you,
Well,
Yeah.
nobody ever told me.
right?
I suffered with this all along, and nobody ever told me what it was or how to
Yeah.
handle it.
I mean, so one of the things we learned, all being somewhere on the neurodiversity scale, is that it's like that thing about you're not handicapped necessarily if there are ramps everywhere.
Right.
Well, you're not, being dyslexic is not necessarily a bad thing if there are ramps everywhere to help you get to where you need to go.
Right.
And one of the things we learned is that dyslexics have certain gifts that not everybody has.
Yeah.
We tend to be creative. We tend to think differently. We tend to, and so one of the things we learned in our household that we had to do for self-defense was we had to celebrate some of the gifts
Yeah.
of our diversity. And my kids are really bright. So they learned how to manipulate the school system to get out of stuff. I mean, they were good at it.
Creative. Clever. Yes.
Yes, absolutely. So one of the things that I had to do was say to them regularly, always use your powers of dyslexia for good.
Love that. Use your powers of dyslexia for good.
It was
Yeah.
kind of their superhero thing. I mean,
And that's-
they're gifts to
And that really flips the narrative because in most places, there is a really, when you look at this list, most of us understand these things, if we understand them at all, through the ways in which these are problems, through the ways in which there are deficits. Instead of recognizing that there's actually things that go along with these that are actually of benefit of the way that we think. And I think that is a huge opportunity, and I think we're just getting that. I will say, broadly, we are just getting that. I think individuals have known that, right? Regardless of what they've been told.
And I being able to discuss this, and when you are exposed, and this is part of your family and everything, you become familiar with it, and you learn to appreciate it. And for anybody that hasn't been exposed, doesn't have that divergence in their family, this is a good platform. This is a good way to say, hey, look, and to help us as a church, as a community, embrace anybody with
Yeah.
any divergence.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And
It's hard. It's hard.
Well,
Oh, I know.
Because of the masking, and the people you don't know. But I
But
do
Ronald was
appreciate,
telling you it's bad.
no, but I do think
Yeah.
it's fantastic.
And that's going back to the stigmas too. And I know we're over our time, so I do want to wrap up. But you're talking about dyslexia, you know, one of the things is there's little things that we have stigmas on that we don't even realize. There are people who will say it doesn't count as reading a book if you listen to an audiobook. It's just like a really silly thing to argue about. But there are these like micro stigmas about things that are really helping other people, or like it doesn't count if you like run a marathon if you like have like some mobility aid. It's like good gravy. Like they ran a marathon and they probably work harder than half the people. So I want to wrap up because we are over time. If you have like burning questions or things that you want us to cover over the next 2 times that we're going to meet and continue talking about these things, there are note cards in the back next to the handouts. So I invite you to write those down, and then that way I know what to like make sure we like get to, or if I need to find some other resources I can. Yes. So with that, I'll go ahead and close us off in prayer. Dear Lord, thank you so much for the neurodiversity in this room. Thank you for the gift that it always brings us to Bible studies as we look at your word and understand and try and understand you better. We are grateful that you have created us this way so that we together can be more creative and to be able to understand your creation a little bit better. The heart of this church is to be welcoming, and you have equipped us with people who care so deeply about that and do that so well. We just pray that you would aid us in that, and that you would use this knowledge to help us to build our empathy and to build our grace, and for us to make spaces within this church that are welcoming for people to unmask, to be present, and to show up exactly as they are. We thank you and we ask for your continued guidance. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Thanks, y'all. Yeah.
Someone stuck